Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are transporting ourselves to a very specific spot in Potsdam, Germany.
Okay.
We're standing on the terrace of the Sanssouci Palace, looking down at a grave. And if you were to visit this grave today, you wouldn't just see the usual tributes, flowers, maybe a wreath, a flag.
Right, the typical things.
Instead, you are almost guaranteed to see piles of raw potatoes.
Which is a bizarre sight if you don't know the context. You walk up expecting, solemnity, and instead it looks like someone spilled a grocery bag.
Exactly. It looks like a prank, but it is actually a deeply sentimental tribute to the man buried there.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Frederick the Great, or, as the locals affectionately call him, Der Kartoffelkönig, the Potato King.
The Potato King. It sounds like a character from a children's book, doesn't it?
It really does. Something whimsical.
But that nickname hides a much more complex and, frankly, much darker reality. It refers to his relentless, almost tyrannical campaign to force Prussian farmers to adopt the potato to prevent famine. And that really sets the stage for everything we are going to talk about today.
It really does. Because when you peel back the layers, pun intended,
Yeah.
Frederick is arguably one of the most confusing, contradictory figures in European history.
Absolutely.
We have a man who is remembered as a flute-playing philosopher, a guy who hated the German language, wrote French poetry, and hung out with Voltaire.
And yet, simultaneously, this is the man who single-handedly forged the Prussian military state.
Right.
He's the Iron King who plunged Europe into decades of bloodshed, perfected military strategies still studied at West Point.
And was later idolized by the Nazis as the ultimate German hero.
Exactly. That's the core contradiction.
That is the central tension we need to unpack. We have the sensitive soul on one side and the ruthless warlord on the other. And the mission for this deep dive is to figure out how those two people existed in the same body. How does a man who wrote a book called Anti-Machiavel, literally arguing against Machiavelli's cynicism, end up becoming the absolute master of Machiavellian geopolitics?
To understand that, we have to start with what I would call one of the most brutal origin stories in royal history.
Okay.
You cannot understand Frederick the Great without understanding the absolute nightmare that was his childhood, specifically his relationship with his father, King Frederick William I.
The father is known to history as the Soldier King.
Right.
And that title makes him sound kind of noble, maybe a bit stern. But from what I have read, noble is not the word I would use.
Not at all.
Psychopath feels closer.
It's not far off. Frederick William was a very specific type of tyrant. He was violent, authoritarian, and obsessed with the military to a degree that bordered on mania.
Bomania.
He viewed his entire kingdom as one giant barracks. He was famous for walking the streets of Berlin with a heavy cane, and if he saw a citizen who looked like they were, idling or spending money on something frivolous,
He won.
he would beat them. Right there in the street.
Just beat random citizens.
Anyone he felt wasn't contributing to the efficiency of the state. He was frugal to the point of madness. He sold off his father's crown jewels. He melted down the silverware to buy muskets. And he had this obsession with the Potsdam giant.
Oh, the giants. This is one of those details that sounds completely made up.
It does. But it's true. He created a special regiment of soldiers who all had to be over 6 feet tall, which was enormous for the 18th century.
Giants.
He collected them like toy figures. He bought them from other monarchs. He even had agents kidnap tall men from other countries to force them into the regiment.
That's kidnapping.
It was. And it wasn't even about combat effectiveness. It was a fetish. He just liked looking at them.
So this is the environment young Frederick is born into. A father who despises anything soft, anything artistic, anything he deems French.
Which he saw as effeminate.
And young Frederick. Well, he is basically an emo kid.
Chuckles. That is a perfect description. He is the ultimate emo kid. He's sensitive. He hates hunting. He hates riding horses.
He just wants to stay in his room and listen to music.
And read poetry. He loves literature. He plays the flute. And he speaks French better than he speaks German. In fact, he despised German. He called it a boor's language.
A boor's language, which must have driven the Soldier King absolutely insane.
It made him apoplectic. Frederick had a secret library of about 3,000 volumes, mostly French poetry, Greek and Roman classics, that he had to hide. If his father found them, he would throw them in the fire.
And when we say the father disapproved, we aren't talking about a stern lecture or being grounded.
No. We are talking about systematic physical and psychological abuse.
It was brutal.
The king would beat Frederick publicly. He would humiliate him in front of the court. He dragged him by his hair through the palace.
Wow.
He would mock him, calling him a fife player and a poet, using those terms as slurs. He viewed Frederick's artistic interests as a personal failure, a sign that his heir wasn't man enough to rule Prussia.
Imagine the psychological pressure. You are the crown prince, you can't quit, you can't move out, and your father, who has absolute power over life and death, thinks your very existence is a mistake.
It created a pressure cooker, and eventually that pressure exploded in what is known as the Katte affair.
Right.
This is the turning point. This is the moment that breaks the boy and makes the king.
This is the escape attempt in 1730. Frederick is 18 years old.
Right. He just couldn't take it anymore. He planned to flee to Great Britain with a close friend, a young officer named Hans Hermann von Katte.
And their relationship was intense.
Very intense. Historians have debated the nature of their relationship for centuries, but let's be real.
They're 18, they're inseparable, they're writing these incredibly emotional letters, and they're risking deaths to run away together.
The consensus among modern historians is that they were lovers, but whether it was romance or just an incredibly deep friendship, Katte was Frederick's rock. He was the one person who understood him.
And the plan went horribly wrong.
A complete disaster. They were caught before they could cross the border. And because they were military officers, the king didn't see this as a teenage rebellion or a family squabble.
No.
He saw it as desertion. He saw it as treason. Frederick William actually considered executing his own son.
Executing the crown prince of Prussia.
He seriously debated it. He was that furious. The courts and foreign diplomats had to beg him not to do it.
Unbelievable.
He eventually relented on killing Frederick, but he decided to make an example of Katte. And the cruelty of this punishment is hard to fathom.
It's straight out of a horror movie.
It is. He imprisoned Frederick in the fortress of Kustrin. He stripped him of his rank. And then he ordered that Katte be beheaded. But not just beheaded.
No, there was a twist.
He ordered that the execution take place right outside Frederick's cell window.
And he forced Frederick to watch.
Soldiers held Frederick's head to the window so he couldn't look away. Accounts say Frederick shouted out the window to Katte as he was being led to the block, screaming, "Pardonnez-moi, mon cher Katte. Forgive me, my dear Katte."
And Katte.
What did he do?
Katte, with incredible dignity, called back that he forgave him, that he was happy to die for his prince. And then the sword fell.
Oh, man.
Frederick fainted immediately. He was so distraught that for days afterwards, people feared he would die of grief or take his own life. He was hallucinating, seeing Katte's ghost.
That is the moment. That is where the Potato King is really born. You don't come back from that as the same person.
You don't. The soft, artistic boy died in that tower along with Katte. The man who walked out had built a shell of iron around his heart.
Survival mechanism.
Totally. He realized that to survive, he couldn't fight his father openly. He had to submit outwardly. He adopted a sense of predestination, this chilling idea that his life was not his own.
He learned to wear the mask.
Exactly. He became the good son. He started doing the administrative drudgery his father demanded. He studied war. He memorized the drill manuals.
Whatever it took. He even agreed to a marriage he didn't want, to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Bevern. He wrote to his sister, "There can be neither love nor friendship between us." But he went through with the wedding to please the king.
He buried his true self deep down where the king couldn't hurt it anymore.
And then, in 1740, the old soldier king finally dies. And I imagine the rest of Europe breathed a huge sigh of relief.
Oh, absolutely. They looked at Frederick, this flute-playing, French-speaking intellectual who had been writing letters about tolerance and philosophy, and they thought, okay, Prussia's going to relax now.
The monster is dead. We are going to have a soft, enlightened neighbor.
And that is the biggest bait and switch in history, because almost immediately Frederick shocks everyone.
He invades Silesia.
Out of nowhere.
This was a rich industrial province belonging to Austria. The Holy Roman Emperor had just died, and his daughter, the young Maria Theresa, had taken the throne.
And Frederick saw an opportunity.
He saw a young woman on the throne, he saw a disputed succession, and he thought, I can take this.
It is pure cynicism. He writes a book called Anti-Machiavel, and then pulls a move that Machiavelli would have given a standing ovation.
It was pure opportunism. He famously said later, regarding his strategy, "When you want to catch mice, you have to keep the mousetrap open." He let the Austrian troops cross the mountains so he could trap them.
A classic maneuver.
But, and this is important, his first major battle, the Battle of Mollwitz in 1741, was actually a disaster for him personally.
This is a story I love because it makes him so human. We think of Frederick the Great, military genius, but in his first battle, He panicked.
He panicked completely. The Austrian cavalry charged. The Prussian cavalry, which was the weak link at the time, collapsed. It was chaos. Snow was blinding them.
And Frederick thought it was over.
He thought the battle was lost. His advisors practically threw him on a horse and told him to run to avoid being captured. So the king gallops off into the night to hide in a mill.
Meanwhile, back on the battlefield.
Meanwhile, his infantry, the soldiers his father had drilled so relentlessly, the walking machines, they didn't break.
They held the line.
Under the command of Field Marshal Schwerin, they stood like a stone wall. They fired volley after volley with mechanical precision until the Austrians broke.
So Frederick wakes up the next morning, probably thinking he's lost his kingdom, and his general rides up and says,
"Congratulations, Your Majesty, you won!" While you were running away. It was incredibly humiliating.
I can't even imagine.
But Frederick later called Mollwitz his school. He realized that his father's training had created a great army, but he wasn't a great general yet.
And this is what's different about him.
Yes, he didn't execute the people who saw him flee, he analyzed it. He spent the next few years obsessively retraining his cavalry, studying tactics, and refining his approach. He vowed never to leave the field again.
And he kept that promise. This kicks off a series of wars that basically consumes the next 20 years of his life. And this is where we see him evolve from a student into a master. We have to talk about the oblique order.
This is his signature move. It's what Napoleon studied. It's what changed warfare.
But help me out here, because when I read about it, attacking on the flank, it sounds like military tactics 101. Why was this considered so revolutionary?
It's all about the execution and the geometry. In the 18th century, armies were like two long walls moving toward each other.
Right.
You line up parallel, you march forward, you shoot. It's a shoving match. The longer line usually wins.
Just a numbers game.
Exactly. Frederick realizes, I am always outnumbered. Prussia is a small state. If he fights line against line, he loses. So he changes the geometry.
Ow.
He intentionally weakens one side of his line. He refuses the flank, basically telling those guys, just stay back, act like you're going to attack, but don't engage.
So he's leaving half his army exposed on purpose.
He's baiting the enemy. While the enemy is looking at that weak-looking flank, Frederick takes his elite troops and marches them rapidly, often using hills or fog to hide the movement, all the way to the other side.
To the opposite flank.
He hits the enemy's weak spot with overwhelming local superiority.
So instead of 40,000 versus 60,000 across the whole field, he creates a situation where it's maybe 20,000 Prussians versus 5,000 Austrians on just the right tip.
Precisely. He smashes that flank, and then the rest of the enemy line just sort of crumbles. He rolls them up like a carpet.
And the ultimate example of this is Leuthen, right?
The Battle of Leuthen in 1757 is the masterpiece. He's facing 65,000 Austrians. He has maybe 39,000 men.
That's almost 2 to 1. He should have been crushed.
He should have been. But he marches his troops in this bizarre formation hidden behind a ridge. The Austrians think he's retreating. By the time they realize he's actually on their flank, it's too late.
He just demolishes them.
It is still studied today as a masterpiece of tactical maneuvering. Napoleon Bonaparte later visited Frederick's tomb and said, "Gentlemen, if this man were alive, I would not be here."
That is high praise coming from Napoleon.
The highest.
But despite these tactical wins, the 7 Years' War sounds like it was an absolute nightmare for Prussia. It wasn't just Austria they were fighting, was it?
No, it was Prussia against the world. A massive coalition formed against him. Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, and the Holy Roman Empire.
The whole neighborhood.
Basically, yeah. Prussia was surrounded. The odds were impossible. Frederick famously described himself during this time as fighting like a gladiator in the arena. He was constantly marching, constantly outnumbered.
And the toll on him personally must have been immense. This is the sensitive soul being forced to live in mud and blood for years.
It destroyed him physically and mentally. He aged 20 years and 5. He lost his teeth. He suffered from gout. And the losses were devastating.
Kunersdorf.
At the Battle of Kunersdorf in 1759, he suffered his worst defeat. Half his army was destroyed. Frederick himself was almost killed. He had 2 horses shot out from under him.
And this is where we get that cinematic detail about the snuff box.
Yes. A bullet actually struck him in the chest, but it hit a golden snuff box he was carrying in his coat pocket. The box shattered, but it stopped the bullet. It saved his life.
That is incredible luck. But after Kunersdorf, even he thought it was over.
He was suicidal? He carried a vial of poison around his neck for the rest of the war in case of capture. He wrote to his ministers saying that all was lost, that he would not survive the doom of his country. Berlin was even raided by Russian and Austrian troops.
So Prussia was on the brink of total collapse.
Absolutely.
So how did he survive? How does Prussia not get wiped off the map?
It is what Frederick called the miracle of the House of Brandenburg.
The miracle.
In 1762, just as things looked completely hopeless, the Empress Elizabeth of Russia died. She'd been a fierce enemy of Frederick, obsessed with destroying him.
Okay.
Her successor was her nephew, Peter III.
And Peter III was a bit different.
Peter III was a Frederick the Great superfan, a stan in modern terminology.
You're kidding.
Not at all. He idolized Frederick. He dressed his own soldiers in Prussian-style uniforms. He called Frederick my king, my master.
So the enemy leader dies, and the guy who takes over is the president of your fan club.
Exactly. One of the first things Peter did was switch sides. He pulled Russia out of the war against Prussia and actually offered troops to help Frederick.
Wow.
It completely broke the coalition. It was a stroke of luck so massive that it reinforced Frederick's belief that he was destined for something, that fate was intervening.
So he survives the war, he keeps Silesia, and Prussia emerges as a great power. But I want to pivot now to what he was doing when he wasn't on the battlefield.
His domestic policy.
Because remember, this guy called himself the first servant of the state. That is a very different vibe from, I am the king, I am chosen by God, do what I say.
It is a core part of his philosophy, which historians call enlightened absolutism. The idea was that the monarch has absolute power, yes, but that power must be used for the benefit of the people, not for the monarch's luxury.
It sounds great in a press release.
Yeah.
I work for you.
It does. But when Frederick said servant, he didn't mean he was going to listen to voters. He meant he was going to work harder than anyone else to tell them what to do.
A micromanager.
On a continental scale, we have accounts of his daily routine. He was up at 3:00 or 4 a.m.
And we have to mention the coffee. This detail stuck with me.
Chuckles, the coffee. He brewed it incredibly strong, often using champagne instead of water.
Champagne and coffee.
Or he would lace it with mustard and peppercorns.
Wait, mustard? Was he trying to wake up or punish his stomach?
He wanted the kick. He needed to jolt his system awake because he had mountains of paperwork. He reviewed every expense. If a village wanted to build a bridge, Frederick had to sign off on the timber budget.
He didn't trust anyone else.
Not really. He believed that if he wasn't watching, everyone would become corrupt or lazy.
And this service led to some pretty progressive policies, especially regarding religion.
By 18th century standards, yes. He famously said, all religions must be tolerated, for in this country, everyone must go to heaven in his own way.
Which is a beautiful quote. It sounds very modern.
It is, but we have to be careful not to project 21st century values onto him. He wasn't tolerant because he loved diversity. He was tolerant because he was a cynic and a pragmatist.
He didn't care about the theology.
Not at all. He was likely a deist or an atheist. To him, Catholics, Protestants, Calvinists, they were all just taxpayers.
Right.
If you were willing to work, pay taxes, and serve in the army, he didn't care who you prayed to. He even built a massive Catholic cathedral, St. Hedwig's, in the center of Protestant Berlin just to show he could.
But there was a limit to that tolerance. We have to talk about the anti-Semitism, because this is where the enlightened label really peels off.
We do. This is the dark side of his pragmatism. While he didn't launch violent pogroms like some other rulers, he was deeply prejudiced. In his political testament, he wrote very harsh anti-Semitic things.
So it wasn't just unspoken.
Oh, no, it was written down.
Yeah.
He viewed the Jewish population entirely through a utilitarian lens.
Useful but dangerous in his mind.
Exactly. He limited the number of Jews allowed in cities. He levied special humiliating taxes on them, like the porcelain tax, where Jews were forced to buy substandard porcelain from the royal factory just to get a marriage license.
That's awful.
He viewed them as a disadvantage to the state, except for their utility in trade and finance, especially on the Polish border. So it wasn't moral equality, it was exploitation.
And that pragmatism extended to his other reforms, like law and agriculture.
Yes. He abolished most forms of judicial torture and restricted the death penalty, which was huge for the time.
And he was obsessed with making the land productive, draining swamps.
The Oderbruch region.
Yeah.
He saw uncultivated land as useless barbarism. He drained these massive wetlands to create new farmland. He called it his peopling policy, bringing in thousands of colonists to settle these new lands.
And this brings us back to the potato.
The potato king.
Exactly.
Frederick realized that the potato was a nutritional powerhouse compared to grain. It was less susceptible to bad weather and could feed more people per acre, but the Prussian peasants were suspicious of it.
Right.
They grew underground, it looked dirty, they thought it was poisonous or fit only for dogs, it wasn't in the Bible, all these superstitions.
So how did he convince them?
There is a famous legend, and while historians debate if it happened exactly like this, it perfectly captures his style.
Okay, the story.
The story goes that he planted a field of potatoes near Berlin and had it guarded by his best soldiers during the day.
Reverse psychology.
Exactly. The peasants looked at the guards and thought, well, if the king is guarding it, it must be valuable like gold.
That must be some special root.
Right. So at night, when the guards were instructed to look the other way, the peasants snuck in, stole the plants, and started growing them in their own gardens.
He tricked them into not starving.
Whether that specific story is true or not, he did issue official potato edicts forcing the cultivation of the crop. He sent instructions on how to cook them, and it worked. It undoubtedly saved thousands from starvation.
So we have the Soldier King 2.0. We have the first servant of the state. Now let's go to his private life. Let's go to Sanssouci.
Sanssouci. The name means without care or no worries in French.
His happy place.
This was his sanctuary in Potsdam. It wasn't a grand, imposing palace like Versailles meant to intimidate. It was a private retreat on a human scale. It sits on top of these beautiful vineyard terraces.
And the vibe there was strictly French.
Strictly, Frederick essentially created a French island in the middle of Prussia. At dinner, you had to speak French. If you spoke German, you were mocked.
And this is where the philosopher king really lived. He wasn't just posing as an intellectual.
Not at all. He was a prolific composer. He wrote 121 flute sonatas and 4 symphonies. And they are good. They are still performed today.
He was a serious musician.
Very serious. He practiced the flute 4 times a day, even during his military campaigns. Imagine being a general in the next tent, hearing the king practicing scales after a battle.
The contrast is insane.
And he had this famous encounter with J.S. Bach.
The musical offering.
Exactly. Bach visited Potsdam, and Frederick, who admired him greatly, gave him this incredibly complex musical theme and challenged him to improvise a fugue on the spot.
Which Bach did.
And then he went home and wrote an entire collection of pieces based on the royal theme, which he called the musical offering. It's a legendary moment in music history.
But the man writing these flute sonatas was also, debasing currency to fund brutal wars.
The ultimate contradiction.
And he surrounded himself with the greatest minds of Europe, the most famous guest being Voltaire.
The rock star of the Enlightenment. Frederick courted him for years. When Voltaire finally came to stay at Sanssouci, it was a meeting of the minds, but it was also a disaster.
Too many egos in one palace.
Way too many. They admired each other's intellect, but they clashed constantly. Voltaire was snarky and loved to gossip. Frederick was authoritarian and thin-skinned.
It didn't end well.
Not at all. Voltaire eventually fled Prussia, and Frederick actually had him arrested at the border to get back a book of poetry. It was a messy breakup.
Speaking of breakups, Sanssouci was also notable for who wasn't there.
His wife, Queen Elizabeth Christine. Frederick essentially banned her from his court. Once his father died, he separated from her completely. He set her up in a palace in Berlin, paid for her staff, visited her formally maybe once a year on her birthday, and that was it.
No affection at all.
None. He never showed her any.
And this leads us to the topic of his sexuality. The outline mentions he was almost certainly homosexual.
The historical evidence is quite strong. Beyond the tragic relationship with Katte in his youth, his private circle at Sanssouci was almost exclusively male.
And there were specific relationships.
Yes, he had close, ambiguous relationships with figures like Michael Gabriel Fredersdorf, his valet who became a close confidant and arguably the most powerful man in Prussia behind the scenes. And then there was the Italian intellectual, Count Algarotti.
It's interesting because today he is often viewed as an icon of LGBTQ history. But in his own time, he had to be incredibly discreet.
Well, sodomy was still a capital crime in many places. Even for a king, openness was impossible. But his contemporaries knew. People talked.
An open secret.
It was an open secret in the courts of Europe. Enemies would write pamphlets calling him the King of Sodom. It added to his image as an eccentric, an outsider. He didn't have a mistress. He didn't produce an heir. He was a singularity.
So we have painted a picture of a complex, brilliant man. But we have to go to the darker side. We already touched on his anti-Semitism, but there is also his foreign policy later in life, specifically regarding Poland.
This is one of the darkest stains on his legacy, the partition of Poland.
Right.
Frederick looked at the map and saw that his kingdom was split. He had East Prussia on one side, Brandenburg on the other, and Polish territory in the middle. He wanted to connect the dots.
And he did that by carving up a neighboring country.
Yes. In 1772, along with Russia and Austria, he orchestrated the first partition of Poland. They literally just redrew the map and took what they wanted.
He took the land in the middle.
He annexed a huge chunk of Polish territory, which he called West Prussia. It connected his lands, but the way he did it and the way he talked about it was chilling.
He mocked Maria Theresa about it, didn't he?
He did. Maria Theresa of Austria was very religious and felt guilty about dismembering a sovereign Catholic state. She was weeping while signing the treaty.
And Frederick's response?
He quipped, "She cries, but she takes." He was completely cynical about it.
And his view of the Polish people wasn't exactly enlightened.
No. This is where his colonial mindset comes out. He referred to the Polish territories as barbaric. He said he found in West Prussia nothing but sand, fir trees, heath, and Jews.
Wow.
He even compared the Poles to the Iroquois, which gives you an idea of how he viewed indigenous peoples in general.
As savages to be civilized.
Exactly. He wanted to Germanize the region, replacing Polish culture and laws with Prussian efficiency. He viewed himself as bringing civilization, which was a common justification for imperialism, but he applied it right in the heart of Europe.
That cynicism contrasts so sharply with the flute-playing humanitarian. It's hard to reconcile.
It really is.
And speaking of dark legacies, we have to talk about who his biggest fans were in the 20th century.
The Nazis. This is tragic because it really distorted how the world saw Frederick for a long time. The Nazis, and Hitler specifically, absolutely idolized Frederick the Great.
They saw him as the ideal German.
The ultimate German hero, the man who stood alone against the world and won by sheer will.
I read that Hitler kept a portrait of Frederick in his bunker right until the end.
He did. It was an oil painting by Anton Graf. When Hitler was in the Führer bunker in 1945, refusing to surrender while Berlin burned above him, he was staring at that portrait.
Hoping for a miracle.
He was hoping for another miracle of the House of Brandenburg. He thought that if he just held on, the alliance between the U.S. and the Soviets would break, just like the coalition against Frederick broke.
But the Nazis were selective history readers, weren't they?
Extremely selective. They glorified the militarism, the discipline, the will to power. They loved the soldier king aspect.
And ignored everything else.
They conveniently ignored the Francophile, who hated German culture. They ignored the philosopher who believed in tolerance. They ignored the fact that Frederick probably would have despised the Nazis as boorish thugs.
They hijacked his image.
They did, and because of that, after World War II, Frederick was seen by the Allies as a bad guy. His statue on Unter den Linden in Berlin was taken down by the East Germans. Prussia itself was abolished as a state.
Why?
Because the Allies saw it as the source of German militarism.
It has taken a long time for historians to reclaim the real Frederick from that shadow.
It has. Since reunification in Germany, there has been a more balanced view. We can now see him as he was, an enlightened absolutist, a man who modernized the legal system, abolished torture, promoted education, but also waged brutal wars and held prejudiced views. He is a figure of his time, not a proto-Nazi.
Let's fast forward to the very end of his life. The year is 1786. Frederick is an old man. He is lonely. His friends are mostly dead. Who is he with?
He is with his greyhounds. He loved his dogs more than he loved most people. He had a favorite named Biche. He once said, "Dogs have all the virtues of men without their vices."
So it's just him and his dogs?
He died in an armchair at Sanssouci, quiet and alone, with his dogs at his feet.
And he had a very specific request for his burial, which I think says everything about who he really was inside.
He wanted to be buried on the terrace at Sanssouci in a simple crypt he had prepared right next to his dogs.
Not in some grand church.
No, he wanted a simple funeral without pomp. He explicitly said he wanted to be buried as a philosopher, not a king. He wanted to rest in the place where he was happiest.
And naturally, his successor ignored that completely.
Completely. His nephew, Frederick William II, thought it was undignified to bury a king next to dogs. It was an embarrassment.
So what did he do?
So he had Frederick buried in a church in Potsdam, the garrison church, right next to his abusive father, the soldier king.
That is a cruel irony.
Yeah.
To be trapped in death next to the man who tormented you in life, the man who made you watch your best friend die.
It is heartbreaking. And he stayed there for over 200 years. His coffin was moved around during World War II to protect it from bombing hidden in a salt mine, then moved to a castle.
And it wasn't until after the fall of the wall.
Finally, in 1991, after the Berlin Wall fell, his body was brought back to Sanssouci.
A final homecoming.
Yes. There was a ceremony, though still perhaps more pomp than he would have liked. and he was finally laid to rest in the grave on the terrace next to his greyhounds.
And that brings us back to the potatoes.
Exactly. That is why people leave potatoes on that grave. It is a tribute to the complex legacy of a man who conquered provinces and drilled soldiers, but also cared enough to ensure his people didn't starve. It's a nod to the first servant.
It really is a fascinating story.
Yeah.
You have this man who was beaten for being soft, who then became the hardest man in Europe, but who never quite lost that love for the flute and the philosophy book.
It is the ultimate paradox. He built the foundation of the modern German state, the bureaucracy, the military, the economy, but he did it while despising the German language and culture.
A man of contradictions to the very end.
He believed in reason and the Enlightenment, but he practiced ruthless conquest.
So what does this all mean for us? I think Frederick forces us to ask a really difficult question about leadership. He called himself the first servant of the state. In our modern world, we hear politicians say they are public servants all the time, but Frederick actually lived it. He worked himself to the bone. Yet, he was an absolute dictator.
That is the provocative thought I would leave you with. Can you truly be a servant when you hold absolute power? Frederick believed he knew what was best for the people better than they did themselves, whether it was planting potatoes or going to war. He served the state, the abstract idea of Prussia, sometimes at the expense of the actual people living in it.
It is the difference between serving the people's will and serving the people's interests,
Yeah.
as defined by one man.
Exactly. And that is a tension between efficiency and liberty, between the strong leader and the democratic process that didn't die with Frederick the Great.
Something to chew on, maybe while eating a potato. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating figures. We will catch you next time.